Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman.
Well, Leonard, we have an important guest today because we've talked a lot about threats to free speech. We've talked about the military-industrial complex. We've talked about, militarism in general, money in politics. But the elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about is technology, and these technologists who are all weird and are trying to take over the world. And they even get booed at commencement speeches now. So the zeitgeist is definitely not in their favor, but I don't know if they worry about the zeitgeist. So why don't you tell us a little bit about our guest? And
Yeah, well, I think we have the perfect guest to help us try to understand what's going on in Silicon Valley. Alan McLeod is an investigative journalist. He is a senior staff writer for MintPress News and specialist in deep state reporting. So we're very excited to have you. Welcome, Alan.
welcome, Alan.
Gentlemen, it's fantastic to be with you.
Thank you. So I was just reading your most recent article about Greg Brockman, co-founder of ChatGPT. And so maybe we could start sort of on that area. It seems like these tech companies are increasingly becoming more and more intertwined with the state, and in particular the US military and the security state. People throw around terms like fascism to describe Trump, but isn't my understanding of fascism is sort of the merger of big business and the state, especially the security state. So I guess that's one thing maybe we could start with. Are we there yet? Is that something to be concerned with, that merger?
Oh, 100%. Listen, these big tech companies, we're talking about corporations that maybe even started off small, but in just a couple of decades, they have risen to become gigantic behemoths, the size of which we could only have dreamed of a couple of decades ago when the internet was in its nascent state. And one of those companies that's actually one of the newest is OpenAI, the group behind ChatGPT. And Greg Brockman, as you said, he is the one of the most important people in that organization. He co-founded OpenAI, and now he really has President Trump's ear because he's been spending tens of millions of dollars to try to make sure Trump and his allies stay in power permanently. He recently gave $25 million to a pro-Trump super PAC, and then he gave even more money to his own new super PAC, which is a bipartisan effort aimed at trying to promote AI in every single field, to try to push it into every facet of our lives, and crucially to attack politicians and lawmakers who offer any sort of resistance or scrutiny over the power of AI. So we're rapidly reaching a situation where, as you said, state and big tech, these corporations are merging into one. The point of all this, you know, obviously is to make money, but it's also about political control. And that's where I want to go back to what you just said at the start there. This is really the merging of big tech and big government to the point where, as a big tech reporter, I'm finding it very difficult to see where one ends and the other begins.
Could we maybe back up for a second and talk a little bit about the technology? Because I may be one of the few people in this country, I'm not exactly sure where Pat is, but I don't use AI. I've maybe used it once by accident, and I was not impressed with what it told me. So I'm quoting from your article, and this is, I think, a quote from Brockman himself, saying that AI is the most impactful thing humanity has ever created. Is that true? Is this really that impactful, or is it more because of its usefulness to the security state that is the excitement sort of overblown because of its closeness to the security state and its usefulness for a lot of ways, which hopefully we'll get into. But let's just talk about the technology. Is this really groundbreaking, humanity shaking technology?
Well, in some fields, you may find some real use for it, but we do have to take people like Brockman's words with more than a pinch of salt here. Of course, his entire fortune, his career, his political and economic interests are all merged around the idea of trying to get everyone to buy into the concept that AI is the technology of the future. If not, OpenAI's stock price will fall and Brockman's fortune will reduce. So, of course, Brockman wants it to be the technology of the future. I very much hope it won't be, because so often this technology seems to be, hashed together, seems not to really be such an improvement on what we've already got. In terms of LLMs or just asking questions to things like ChatGPT, it just sort of scrapes the internet for previous questions that have been asked on sites like Quora or Reddit, and then spits out a sort of hodgepodge of the top few answers that it's found, and then sends it back to you. So in the case of the way in which most people are using it, it really is not so much different to Google, which is a system that we've had for many decades now. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, AI, this sort of technology, is not anything particularly new. There are certainly areas which this could be pretty revolutionary, for example, in medical sciences and what have you. But in terms of for ordinary people, I think there's more hype than reality here.
Well, Alan, one of the things that I've noticed people use AI for now is to sort of regulate reality a little bit. So if you're on X ever, Grok is sort of tied in with X, when there's a photograph, when there's a clip, maybe of something happening in the Middle East, some user, the number one poster is going to say, "Hey, Grok, is this true? Grok, is this real?" And so if Grok says it's real, it's real. If Grok says it's not real, okay, then everyone moves on, right? So that's become kind of the arbiter of reality. And I'm sure that that's not lost on anyone in government, that, hey, if we can, I've heard that the Israelis have sort of picked up on this in the last few weeks, that, hey, if we can get in the code in the AI and, we can start warping reality to our own reality. And so is that part of the attraction? And there must be one of the attractions to AI being a reality shifting tool.
Yeah, and especially because the majority of these AI companies, these big tech companies, have extremely close links to the US national security state, links that have been fostered over the past couple of decades. And in some cases, in Google's, for example, actually existed before the company was even birthed. Um, yeah, I mean, as an older millennial who went through and, was previously an academic, I was always interested by my elders who always said, your generation, it's a very worrying one, how, you guys think that anything you find on Google is true, whereas if you really want to get into controversial subjects of history, of economics, of politics, of sociology, you're going to have to go much deeper than a couple of Google searches. You're actually going to have to read books. And unfortunately, the generation below me isn't even doing the Google searches and reading websites anymore, let alone books. They're simply turning to AI, even though public polls show that when asked, they say, "Oh yeah, I don't believe AI is particularly trustworthy." Their actions show that actually they do seem to live as if AI is a trustworthy source. And I'm reminded of that great quote at the start of Frank Herbert's Dune, when he said, "Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with the machines to enslave them." I'm very worried about we're going down a very deep, dark, dystopian future whereby people outsource their thinking, their critical thinking skills to machines and algorithms that are controlled by billionaires and some of the largest transnational corporations that have ever existed.
Well, speaking of this sort of turning over to the security state, your article talks about leaked documents that show how the FBI and Department Department of Homeland Security are anticipating a wave of domestic upheaval. And ironically, preparing for that using AI and surveillance tools. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is that something we have to be worried about, that now we're going to be all domestic terrorists if we're not fully on board with this new technology?
Yeah, you asked earlier about how will AI be revolutionary. In some ways, it could be counter-revolutionary in the sense that it could certainly provide the basis for the destruction of communities across America and across the world. What I mean by that is that AI, not only these gigantic data centers are terrible for people who live in the vicinity, not only because they drive up the price of water and electricity, and in some cases, it might mean that ordinary residents don't even have access to those things if they live by a big AI data center. But also, AI is threatening to take the jobs of entire industries. And of course, industries aren't just scattered out across the country willy-nilly. They're actually centered in certain places. Detroit was known as a car manufacturing hub in the late 20th century. That is gone and the city is destroyed. Likewise, if AI takes over certain professions, we could see entire communities, entire cities, entire towns left without any sort of economic basis. And so that's what this FBI and Department of Homeland Security leak was really talking about. Over more than 1,000 pages of documents, they were talking about how the forces of repression in the United States have to start preparing for widespread AI riots that's going to be taking place across the country, especially in cities, like they said, large urban areas like New York City, where they're anticipating that AI might hit the worst. So this is going to cause potentially huge economic dislocation. And rather than plan for that in the sense of giving people a safety net or some sort of netting to a parachute or something to break their fall, they are going after them and choosing the punitive option, which basically means they're actually going to start looking through people's social media and their posts all over the internet to identify people who have anti-AI extremism opinions, and that's their language there, and trying to isolate and neutralize and stamp that out. So yeah, as you said, there's this whole new categorization as anti-AI extremists, which is being put on a par with like Muslim terrorists or white supremacist terror. That is new in the parlance of the FBI and other three-letter agencies in Washington, D.C. So that's the future they are preparing for. And I guess we have to prepare for it ourselves, but prepare and try to build for a much brighter, more hopeful future than the one they seem to be preparing for. Yeah.
Well, one of the things some of our guests have mentioned, I'm thinking of Alexander McCoris, I'm thinking of Jacques Beau, I'm thinking of people who say, politicians today are not responsive to the voters. In fact, they're the opposite of responsive to voters. And so they're figuring out how they can accomplish what they want to accomplish without being responsive at all to voters, and whether it's using technology or psychological operations of various kinds. I mean, a couple of years ago, it was calling everything they didn't like disinformation. Now it's this sort of pre-crime, this idea of pre-crime. And it's interesting because it all goes back, the original pre-crime that I'm familiar with was Paul Heydrich, who was a Nazi, a senior Nazi official, developed the idea of pre-crime in that regime. But it started right after 2001, right, where there was a program called Total Information Awareness, which I'm sure you're aware of, where the FBI after 9/11 said, if we could figure out who is the neighbor of the terrorist and how many phone calls the terrorist made to people and make a net of those people, and then we could put it on a matrix and figure out who's close to that person, and then we could go after them, right? And so that idea, that company of Total Information Awareness, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think that became Palantir. And so what Palantir does is a lot of that kind of surveillance technology, but it's all in service of not being responsive to what voters want. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Listen, when you actually poll voters, only 5% of them express a great deal of trust in AI. And in fact, 77% of Americans say that AI could pose a fundamental threat to humanity. So this is clearly not something that Americans are jumping into bed with. We're clearly very skeptical about all of this. And, I'm reminded of that Princeton study from, a while ago, which found that the United States does not operate as a democracy.
No.
What the majority of Americans who are, at the bottom of the economic pyramid, what they want, often the opposite happens. But if you're at the top 0.1% of Americans, your needs are most peculiarly met, just like how Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations back in the 1870s. And, as you said, Palantir really grew out of this Bush era surveillance state, the growth of it after 9/11 and the Patriot Act and everything like that. And Palantir really sold their products as a way of, really trying to identify terrorists or identify troublemakers. But, honestly, this goes back to the very founding of the internet with the DARPA net in the 1970s. If you go back and have a look at it's not a very old book now, but it feels like a classic, The Surveillance Valley, The Secret History of the Internet by Yasha Levine. He talks about how, the internet was really born in the 1970s out of the Vietnam War and the reaction to the Vietnam War by the FBI and other three-letter agencies. It was the biggest spying operation in world history. Forget anything the Stasi did or anything they said the KGB did. The FBI and the police and other law enforcement agencies had infiltrated virtually every anti-war group across the United States. If you were in the 70s and had a anti-war meeting about Vietnam in a church and there was 5 people there was probably 2 informants or an agent there listening. But the problem is that all of these organizations, they didn't have any way of digitizing and sharing the information they had all brought up and collected. So Washington basically decided or looked at the data and thought, yeah, if we had some way of combining this data, we could have crushed the Vietnam syndrome. And what they meant by that, of course, was widespread public aversion to war. And they thought they could have won the Vietnam War if they'd have just been able to control the population at home. And so that is what the internet was really born out of, a way of trying to combine all the information, all of this data that various government agencies had collected and trying to share it across different government agencies so that this could never happen again. And interestingly, when DARPA and all of these other groups were creating the internet in the 1970s and elite universities like Stanford, the academics there that were part of it knew exactly what was going on. And there were anti-internet demonstrations and agitations by these scientists who were being employed to do this because they understood that this was a tool of surveillance and ultimately a tool of suppression. And if we go through to the Bush era, that's just 3 decades later, and we have an even more sophisticated system. And now, in the cold light of the 2020s, this system that started in the 1970s and was developed throughout the Bush era is now coming to fruition and really blossoming into this absolutely dystopian, worrying, scary network that should really concern every American and every citizen of the world.
This whole sort of theory that this pre-crime information awareness, that we're going to be able to immediately find the criminal before they even commit the crime, it's never come to fruition. And I mean, my personal belief is that really that was never the intent. It's more about control. So that if a person pops up who becomes a threat, whether it's an Alan McLeod or someone else, that where you are a threat to the government, they can dig and find information or plant information or surveil you in a way to disrupt your ability to make trouble for the government. And that's always been my belief, because they never solve any crimes. I mean, whenever there's, a shooter pops up, or a mass shooting, the government never, no matter, even if it's somebody with on the radar of the FBI, they still don't catch these people. And half the crimes that they do, the terror crimes that they do catch, are ones that they create themselves, like you say, when they have informants and infiltrate these organizations. And so let me, you could comment on that, but also I want you to maybe talk a little bit about, why do we need all these data centers? What's in them? Because, I remember a while back they were talking about these centers to just sort of store all our personal information. I think there was one like that was going to be in Utah, or I might have that wrong, but what's going on in these? Why do we need all this power, these gas guzzling and water fouling data centers? What's going on? Is it just for processing all of these search results, or is there something else going on in these data centers? It seems very inefficient that we would need all of these centers all over the country. So can you take it where you will, Alan?
First, I'll comment on your first comment. You know, watching Palestine and really studying it gives you a window into how the system functions. Palestine is very much the empire's workshop, where a lot of the technologies are first brought out and are first battle tested, so to speak. And this is the same with AI and surveillance and data gathering. There's a group in Israel called Unit 8200. It's the most elite group within IDF, and it is dedicated to cyber warfare and intelligence gathering. It's a spying organization. And Unit 8200 has created this enormous dragnet across Palestine, where if you are from Gaza, your every move is tracked constantly by facial recognition cameras in the street, by microphones in the street or in your device, like your television or your phone or whatever. Your every keystroke, your every message, your every conversation on the phone is logged in these gigantic data centers, a lot of which is powered by Microsoft Azure, by the way. But Unit 8200 has these gigantic data centers where it keeps just unimaginable amounts of information on every Palestinian. And why they do that is they do that for surveillance and extortion purposes. They can find out anything about you, for example, if you are secretly gay or having an affair on your wife, and they can use that against you to turn you into an informant. Or if they kill you by accident or deliberately, they can go back through days, weeks, months of recorded conversations that they have on you and find and clip some sort of thing where you say something about how you hate Israel or how you wish you want to kill these guys who are invading you. And then they can trot that out as a justification for you being a radical Islamic militant and you had to be taken out. So yeah, they can go back and find justifications for their crimes. And ultimately, that could be a lesson that is being learnt by the United States and by other Western countries, because that's the kind of way that Israel is using their AI technology and their gigantic data centers. Why do we need these things? In some ways, it's to maintain the United States' control over the narrative. It is to fight China, but to fight China how? In the global information war, of course. If you have control over the medium of communication that the world uses, that gives you an enormous soft power tool. If you're using Google, for example, to find out stuff about anything from the weather to sports to politics to history to economics, the fact that an American organization which has extremely close ties to the CIA, which we can go into if you want, actually has the ability to decide what you see and what you don't see online as an answer to any of your questions that you have. That is incredible soft power to control people's minds, to control people in terms of what they think about, how they think about certain issues. That is, as I said, almost unbelievable, unexaggeratable, the amount of power that gives the United States in that sense. Because, of course, if you're using social media or search engines or whatever, if you're in Botswana, Burundi, Belgium, or Bhutan, it's all the same. We're all using these American platforms. And that, of course, is perhaps the main reason why there was such a freak out in Washington when TikTok became enormously popular. And the Trump administration actually forced through the sale of TikTok to the family of Larry Ellison, who is the IDF's largest private donor and the world's the world's fourth richest man, and a longtime CIA contractor. So yeah, why do we need all these AI data centers? Ultimately, they're banking on the idea that this is going to be the new technology. This is going to be a new cutting edge technology that we're going to use for information and communication in the next few decades. So they want to get out in front of that so they can control it. And that would give them enormous social and soft power in order to control the narrative and to manipulate public opinion globally.
I say one thing, it's interesting that, they created this pre-crime framework and now they're using it for people who don't favor the pre-crime framework. Right? So
Yeah.
if you're not into the data centers, now you've become a criminal. And Larry Fink had an interesting speech about that, where he's like, we've got to arm up to keep these people from, disrupting our data centers, which are massive, by the way, right? Have you been following the one in Utah? With that, there's one there that they're proposing building that's about half the size of the city of Chicago in terms of area, and nobody wants it except the city council. So the city council, everyone came to show up to say they didn't want it. City council voted anyway to have it. I believe there's an effort now underway to unseat those city council members through recall efforts. I'm not sure how it's played out yet, or if it is played out yet, but people do not want this stuff, right? Isn't that?
Oh, of course. I mean, the only people who want it are, ghouls like Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank, who's invested massively in this. And you're talking about he was talking about, oh, well, Utah's already voted on it. But if you actually look at who had to vote, who actually had a vote on that, he's talking about a council of 3 people who voted 3-0. And when you're actually talking about ordinary people, what this is going to do for ordinary people is, number one, it's going to drive up electricity and water prices for ordinary people in Utah, which is not a state blessed with large amounts of water, as I understand. And number two, it's going to cause huge sort of social and medical problems, because these data centers, if there's not enough electricity, they have to run diesel generators to power these gigantic city-size buildings. What that means is they pump all sorts of smoke and chemicals into the air. And people who live beside data centers always, there's good studies of this now, that they report all sorts of medical problems like nausea, migraines, general sickness, vertigo, all headaches, all those sorts of things like this. So, if a data center moves in beside you, you should probably be looking to sell your property almost immediately, because bad things are coming for you. Yeah.
Let me ask you about one other also very troubling offshoot of this technology and the way it's being marketed and merged with the security state. I've been reading. So one of the things that's very concerning to people, even some employees at these big tech companies, is the sort of the autonomous killing and targeting. And I've sort of read some about how this is sold to the government, this technology, and that, we can develop targeting lists. It used to take 30 employees, working for 3 weeks. Now we can do that in, one day with just one employee with AI. And I mean, obviously this is incredibly troubling. I mean, we're nervous to have like a self-driving car driving 80 miles an hour on the freeway, but we're going to trust these AI companies to decide that this is a militant and not a child, to make those distinctions. And of course, we've already seen the results of this. At least there's people that suggest that some of the strike in Russia and the strike in Manab, Iran, where they killed all those schoolgirls could have been the product of AI, which also is so shocking that this was like one of the first things on the target list of the war on February 28th. So, could you comment a little bit about that? And also, is there any revolt? I mean, we read little things about, at Microsoft that some people there's a letter from employees saying we don't want to work on these types of projects. We don't want to be part of the genocide in Gaza. But then it's kind of like you read one article and then it seems to disappear. So, I guess I'm asking sort of two different questions. Take it where you will, Alan.
Yeah, isn't it great that people like Elon Musk not only are centi-billionaires, but are also going to decide who lives and dies in the future? It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about Palestine being the empire's workshop, because this was really ground zero for this sort of AI targeting list. In 2023, Unit 8200, the Israeli cyber warfare division, which I mentioned earlier, also developed AI targeting lists of Palestinians in Gaza. How they did that was they created a score for every single person in Gaza from 0 to 100, 100 being the worst score, like a definite on the kill list. And if your number went above a certain figure, you were automatically added to the AI kill list so that drones or missile strikes could be automatically targeted on your home or your place of work. How that worked was if you, for example, lived in the same building as a known Hamas operative, that would increase your score. If you were in a WhatsApp group with a known Hamas or suspected Hamas militant, that would increase your targeting score. All of this had virtually no human oversight. Even the Unit 8200 agents who have spoken about this says that generally it was about 20 seconds, and all they made sure to see was whether that person was male or female. And if they were male, they would be struck. And there were even children on this list, according to these Unit 8200 agents. Now, these sorts of AI kill lists are just as prone to hallucinations as the stupid stuff you get when you do any Google nowadays, where you see some AI thing and you think, oh, that's completely wrong. As you said, the US attacks on Iran seem to have been generated, these strike lists seem to have been generated with AI. Why else would you attack somewhere called Police Park in Tehran?
Right.
That was just a square with the name Police Park. There was no police there, there was no army, it was a residential square, but then it was still hit. Why did they do that? It seems like an obvious AI hallucination where you just type in, a keyword like police and you just strike everything you find. And this is really important for the military-industrial complex because ever since, ever since the dawn of time, generals and war planners have been struggling with the fact that human beings don't want to kill each other. We naturally shy away from shooting each other. In World War II, the large majority of people in uniform that had guns were actively trying to miss their opponents when they were in the theaters of war. Even people who are employed as drone pilots in places like Utah, who are attacking wedding parties in Afghanistan or, christenings in Iraq or whatever, they actually report very high levels of PTSD, even though they're doing it from, many thousands of feet away across on the other side of the world. They still report feelings of intense guilt, of nightmares, of hallucinations, of huge amounts of negative feelings to what they're doing. So even in that sense, we're seeing some human pushback. And we're
That's
also
like an
seeing
attraction. That's like an attraction of AI. It has no conscience. It's not human.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. AI will not say no. AI will not say this is unethical. AI does not have a conscience. It will just do what the war planners tell them. And that's why they want these autonomous drones or these fighting vehicles that will just do what they're told. In terms of people inside Silicon Valley, there are constantly these pressure campaigns and these groups being formed. One, for example, in Microsoft that was pretty large is No Azure for Apartheid, which is a group of hundreds of Microsoft employees who are trying to raise the alarm about how Microsoft Azure is being used by the Israeli military in order to kill Palestinian civilians. However, what this does is, if they are not successful in their project of reforming or completely changing these tech companies, what happens is the big companies basically find out who they are, and they are either fired or they are forced out, or they just leave in disgust in the end. And so ultimately, the people who ultimately have the biggest consciences, the people who are acting in the most moral and ethical way, tend to filter themselves out of Silicon Valley. It's kind of like the Peter Principle in the sense, the Peter Principle is where everyone rises to the level of their own incompetence. But in Silicon Valley, everyone rises to the level of their own, psychopathy or sociopathy, whereby if they are willing to work on technologies that are going to kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, they will rise up the ladder. But if they start rocking the boat and saying this is wrong, they're going to find themselves forced out very quickly. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, a reinforcement mechanism that Google, which once had its official motto as "Don't be evil," is now one of the most bloodthirsty, rapacious, and quite frankly, evil companies in the world.
Well, I'd just like to point out one thing we talked about with Tucker Carlson last week is the moral erosion of the United States and elsewhere, really. I mean, you described that system by assigning people a score 1 to 100 and then murdering them. On what, in what world was that okay to just say, well, we're going to assign you a score, then murder you, not try to stop you, not arrest you, not give you a trial, but just simply murder you. And as you know, these murders are not targeted, so it might be to blow up your entire apartment building and everybody, all of your neighbors. That's okay. And then, as you say, you sort of make that not just a system, but an automated system, and it just keeps going, and the moral erosion just continues and continues. I think too, when you get to you have autonomous drones, not autonomous drones, but drones, that dominate the battlefield in Ukraine. But when those become autonomous and maybe augmented by land-based drones or robots like those dogs that they have, suddenly they won't need to be killing your kids anymore to send people to war. The wars will be managed by machines. It'll still kill people, but not your people. And then I wonder what happens to the political pushback to wars. A lot of it is, hey, it's not our money, but also not our kids that we want to put at risk in these things. How does that change? Maybe it changes the equation when it's all automatic.
I think that's a fantastic point, Patrick, and I've been thinking about that a lot myself. There was huge pushback to the Vietnam War. We were talking about that earlier, precisely because there was serious consequences for Americans. Young American men were drafted up in huge numbers. They watched the television and just waited to see if, the way it worked is you watch television and there would literally be people pulling balls out of machines being like, April 16th. And if April 16th was your birthday, you were getting drafted and you were going to go fight in Southeast Asia. So there was huge pushback to this precisely because it had very deep real world personal consequences, these sorts of wars. And Americans came home in body bags in their thousands constantly. And ultimately, that is what created pushback for Vietnam. It wasn't the millions of people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos that were being exterminated in what most genocide scholars believe to be a genocide. It was really the impact on ordinary Americans. And as you said, if it's actually machines like drones and these, Boston Dynamics style robots that are being destroyed, suddenly that removes a huge barrier for the military industrial complex and war planners in Washington, this domestic barrier to prosecuting their wars all over the world. Famously, President Nixon wanted to send hundreds of thousands of more troops to Vietnam in his own style of surge, and the generals told him that they couldn't do it precisely because if they did order hundreds of thousands more Americans to go to Vietnam, they would actually need those troops on the streets of every city in America because they anticipated riots across the country. So when you do remove this barrier and it's only robots being killed, I really do worry about the future because there won't be that much sort of pushback. And I also worry because when you get to the very top of society, the sort of people who get there are really willing to mete out just enormous amounts of punishment, pain, and destruction, especially on other parts of the world. I'm reminded of stories that I heard about Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense under Bush. He always liked to play the United States in these war games they do with generals across the world. Donald Rumsfeld always volunteered to play the president of the United States. It was his big dream to be president, and he never got it. So he did it in these war games. And what the generals leaked out was that in every single scenario that they played, Donald Rumsfeld ended up nuking the world. So it is frankly very worrying, and it's almost we're living on borrowed time in the sense that at some point, if we have these nuclear weapons, we're going to use them, and there's going to be somebody who comes in who is less discerning. And if AI starts getting involved in these sorts of decisions, that becomes even more worrying because in tests that we've seen and that have been leaked, AI opts to go for the nuclear option much more frequently than humans do. So it really is a threat to humanity. So 77% of Americans who, as I said in a poll, said that AI could pose a fundamental threat to humanity, they're completely correct.
On the subject of morality, I have this discussion with colleagues here in Chicago who are heavily invested in the defense industry. And we see how this is sort of being forced down our throat. A lot of this technology we're not able to resist. And the argument that I have with some of these people, and I actually have some colleagues that are board members of major defense contractors. And, their defense to this is that they're just a vendor. There's a need and they supply a product. But really what you've written about and described, that's really a very simplistic way of looking at it because there is a merger of these companies and the state. And I think in this latest article you talked about, some of the pacts that this guy is setting up. What's his name again? Brockman. Pacts to sort of overcome any resistance to what he's trying to shove down our throats. And also, I've read a lot of stuff that comes out of these pro-war think tanks that are funded by the arms industry, which is just propaganda for war and against diplomacy, so that there will be no resistance. But diplomacy is almost illegal. Look at the war in Ukraine, and diplomacy with Russia was non-existent under Biden. I think some people had some hopes that it would be different under Trump, and have been sorely disappointed. So, can you talk a little bit about that? People that want to make a lot of money on this and have no conscience, that's fine. But the people that claim to have a conscience and say, we're just vendors, there's a need and we're supplying it. Is that a legitimate way to look at this technology from an investor standpoint?
Well, from an investor standpoint, that's a very self-serving way of thinking about things because, of course, you get to reap the profits and not take any of the sort of moral loss there. But yeah, these arms industry groups like Raytheon, like Lockheed Martin, etc., they make billions of dollars of profit from killing people. They're making a killing off of killing. And what they do is they reap just a little bit of the billions of dollars of profits that they make. They chuck a few million every year to think tanks like CSIS or CNAS or the Atlantic Council or any of these big think tanks in Washington or New York. And what they get from that is these pro-war think tanks pump out reports and documents and studies saying that, the next big threat is Russia, the next big threat is China. We really have to be thinking about, regime change in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua or wherever it is. But the thing about these think tanks is that, yes, they're funded by the arms industry, and they constantly put out pro-war propaganda. And this has an effect in Washington. They are, in effect, trying to create the demand for war so that they can supply the weapons there. And this has become even more relevant to our conversation to the tech world because, of course, the 21st century, the battlefield now is highly digitized, computerized, to the point where companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft are gigantic defense contractors. That's where they make an enormous percentage of their profits. Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have all signed multi-billion-dollar deals with the CIA and the Department of Defense for cloud computing, for new high-tech software, for vision goggles, for anything you can think of that is, high-tech equipment is being produced by these Silicon Valley behemoths. And so they are very much at the center of the military-industrial complex right now. And yeah, they're reaping the rewards, but it's the people across the world, people in Palestine, people in Iran, who are having to pay the price for this. They are paying the price in blood, but the American taxpayers just pay it out their wallets. Yeah.
Well, how does it? Have you ever listened to Aaron Day, Alan? He's a commentator. I guess he's an investor, but he's very interested in the technocracy. And one of the things that he's said is that, there's a race in the last, the dot-com race. There was sort of a race for primacy because everyone understood, or these people understood, like there was only going to be one Google, there was only going to be one Amazon, there was only going to be one Microsoft, there was only going to be one of these companies that become kind of the monopoly. And so their bet is you have to throw as many millions or billions at it to be that one company that controls the algorithm. And so that's what they're going for. And it's kind of structural. Like if you're in this, that's what is that you've got to win this race by throwing billions into AI and the political influence to make it all happen. But is there another way? Do you see a world where the people make these decisions about what they want and don't want, and that every every country on earth realizes that a strong military means that you've got to have strong technology. It's always been the case that technology wins the day from the Bronze Age forward, right? So they know that. So of course they're going to be hand in glove with our tech industry and our military industry. Do you see another way? Is there a way for people to regain their power and autonomy in this world that we're seem to be heading for?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, first to say that what you were talking about these billionaires throwing billions into this new technology of AI, that's how capitalism works. Peter Thiel said it himself. He said competition is for suckers. What he meant by that is how the market works. Whenever there's this new technology, all of these companies rush out from everywhere and fight for each other. We probably saw this 15 years ago with cell phones. Everyone was making these weird and wonderful designs, and then suddenly Apple really came in and became the big player, and they're now the hegemon who makes the enormous amount of profit. And now the cell phone market is dominated by just a few players like Apple and Samsung. They get to control the prices and they get to make the profits. And now any small company trying to enter that market, it's just impossible. So, that is pretty much how our system has worked, whether it's phones or cars or anything you can think of. Is there a better way to do this? Absolutely. We need on a global level, we need a multipolar world, a democratic world where there is not where there are not countries who are threatening to invade other ones, threatening to sanction other places. But fundamentally, that world cannot be achieved unless we have a more democratic society internally. And so we have to work on that. All of these things have to come together by people like us doing huge amounts of activism, organizing, agitating to try to fight for a better world, a more democratic world, a more democratic future. It's completely possible. Look at, for example, what is happening in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere right now, Bolivia. An undemocratic government is trying to impose austerity and brutal measures that will harm the interests of the working class majority there. The peasants of Bolivia, who barely have a couple of dollars to rub together, have shut down the country, shutting down the highways, organized, across the entire nation and are forcing the president into a huge retreat. That sort of organization is more than possible in today's society, but it does require people to work for that. And it also, frankly, I think it requires us to do more than just sign petitions online or start groups. We have to do face-to-face organizing and do things that our grandparents, our great grandparents did, even if it is a little bit difficult since we're rusty in terms of actually talking to people face to face. But the future is not going to be won online. It's going to be won in the streets.
Part of the reason why we at Integrity Media we champion independent media and independent journalists like yourself is because we see this as part of what you're talking about, kind of our only hope of bringing some sunshine into the darkness of these worlds, of these profit-driven enterprises that don't have our interests at heart. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, I think maybe Pat brought this, reminded me of this quote, I think it's from the Bible, that you can't ride to freedom on Pharaoh's chariot. And a lot of the people that we see, have shows on YouTube, which is owned by Google, and are our days numbered as far as independent journalists and trying to get this information out? Because in some ways it's a heyday for independent journalism. I mean, more and more people are turning away from corporate media. They don't trust it, and they're finding people that they trust online and on platforms like Google or there's
MintPress.
Humble.
Yeah.
So, and MintPress, of course, but still, you are in some ways reliant on the internet, which is more and more privatized and owned by these large companies. So, yeah. So my question is, should we be concerned that the days of being able to go online and find MintPress news and your latest piece maybe are numbered?
The short answer is yes, we're already there. And frankly, this is the big question facing all alternative media, and we are all wrestling with it constantly, every day, every week, every month, fighting against those algorithms that are being set by people in Silicon Valley, in places like Google, in Facebook, in X. Those sorts of gigantic corporations, which, as I've said before, have extremely close links to the US national security state. The great media scholar Mickey Huff always says that, it's okay if media reform isn't your number one issue, but it better be at least your number two issue, because if it isn't, you're never going to get your message out to anyone. As you said, there is a great need and a great want. There's such a hunger for alternative information out there. You can see it. People do not trust the corporate media. Nevertheless, because we're fighting, because we're on these platforms nowadays, we've all been ferried into just a handful of platforms or websites that are all controlled by multi-billionaires who very much don't have our ideas at heart and want to see the system and society maintained as it is for as long as possible. That means we're really fighting an uphill battle. We are constantly demoted, demonetized, deranked, and sometimes even deleted. Conservative content, far-right content, even racist content is constantly pushed into our algorithms, onto our feeds, in front of our eyeballs, precisely because it doesn't fundamentally doesn't challenge the system, whereas radical content, which really gets people to think more critically about the system we live under, that's a threat to big companies like Google, and it can be zapped at any point, not just monetarily, but literally just deleted from the net, as happens regularly. So yeah, we are really fighting an uphill battle on the internet as it exists right now, because people are reliant on these gigantic corporations for their news and views, and we have to break out of that. But the good news is that, as I said, there is a huge market for this. And I was recently reading a CIA document specifically about Cuba in the 1960s, and they were saying that even though they are crushing Cuba, they said that those radical ideas of revolution spread like wildfire among ordinary people. And we have to constantly work to try to snuff those ideas out. Otherwise, they will take us over. So ultimately, this is like the baseline of human experience. We yearn to be free. We yearn to live in a much more equal and fair society. It's just a question of how to get there.
Alan, in a few minutes we have left, could we talk a little bit about Google? Because we haven't, it's come up, but we haven't really focused on it. You know, I have a particular disdain for Google, and I try to avoid using it for a variety of reasons. It's very difficult to avoid Google. But as you say, it sort of has this cute little name, and it's incredibly evil company. And I guess part of the reason I have such disdain for it is, you know, at least Apple, like they are an innovative company. They have developed products that people, you know, use and are, that, you know, for whatever purpose they do seem to provide a lot of value. Google really has done nothing. I mean, you've written about this. I mean, they were, you know, the Google Maps was sort of technology that was given to them by government or the CIA.
Mhm.
A search, like the search engine, the Google search engine, there's nothing innovative about that. I mean, I'm a lawyer. We've been using similar search engines to do legal searches long before Google was established. And so just tell us a little bit about the founding of Google and what value have they really brought to our society?
Yeah, just before you say that, as you said, search engines have existed much longer than Google. In fact, the first popular search engine on the internet was called Magellan. And just as a little tidbit, it was actually developed and co-founded by the sisters of Ghislaine Maxwell. But I'll leave that for another discussion. I'm going to say something which is maybe a little bit controversial. In fact, probably is pretty controversial, but I hope people will listen to me, and by the end of what I'm saying, you'll see why I'm saying it, and maybe you'll even agree. I'm going to say that Google is an outgrowth of the US national security state, and I find it very difficult to see where one ends and the other begins. Google, according to my investigations that I've been doing, now employs literally hundreds of CIA agents or ex-CIA agents in high levels and very influential fields like content moderation, like trust and safety, and security. These individuals who were handpicked from the CIA now control very sensitive algorithms which dictate what the world sees and what they don't see. In their book, the 2013 book, Google CEO Eric Schmidt and the director of Google Ideas, Jared Cohen, said that what Lockheed Martin was to the 20th century for Washington, tech companies like Google will be for the 21st. And they said that in the book. And they got a very interesting person to write the blurb for that, and that was Henry Kissinger, who wrote a glowing praise for this book. Google has, over the years, become a massive military and national security state contractor. But it actually started out, even before it started out as a company, it was already completely intertwined with the CIA. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, his PhD was not only overseen by CIA, but was actually paid for by the CIA as well. In fact, the CIA was a major shareholder in Google as late as 2005. And if you think products that they've developed like Google Earth or Google Street View were made just so you could go and see, you know, what your house looks like where you grew up and see, you know, what it's like, or just trying to find directions to the nearest ice cream store. That's not why it was developed. It was developed for the US military in order to spy on foreign governments, on foreign militaries, so that the US national security state could really understand what its enemies and even what its friends were doing. Google also employs literally hundreds of Unit 8200 former Israeli spies in their midst. They ultimately, as I said, they have these gigantic contracts with the US national security state. There is a revolving door between Google and the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense, whereby former Google executives go into these positions, and former high mandarins of the US national security state are parachuted into top jobs in Google. One example of this is Eric Schmidt himself, the former CEO of Google. He was chairman of both the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and the Defense Innovation Advisory Board, which were both bodies created to help Silicon Valley assist the US military with cyber weapons and stuff. Schmidt was an advisor to both Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice, the Secretaries of State, and he even participated in an unsuccessful 2009 regime change coup against Iran. So this is the sort of person who is in charge of Google. And that is why I say that these organizations, it is highly, highly problematic for anyone who believes in freedom of speech that these are the sorts of organizations that are dictating what we see on the internet and what we don't see. And it's not only one step removed from state censorship, but this is state censorship on a global level, because it's not just Americans that are affected by this. It is everyone in the world who uses Google, which is to say pretty much the entire population.
It's also, I know we have to wrap up, but it's also, I just want to add, it's also an illegal monopoly that the government allows to exist, because it takes, like, I don't know what the number is, but say like 25% of advertising dollars. It's put out almost all the, the old way of advertising in magazines and stuff like that. Google has swallowed all that up, and done it with the government allowing it to destroy all these other businesses and do it in an illegal monopolistic way. So just wanted to add that on there, that their whole existence is basically because the government doesn't enforce the monopoly laws against them.
Yeah, this is one of my I don't want to say pet peeves, but one of my special interests with Google. And I'll also say something slightly controversial, maybe people would agree with me, which is Google has been the biggest threat to alternative media in modern history. And why I say that is that, advertising revenue for media peaked in around 2004. And what happened then was ultimately that companies like Google and Facebook came in and swallowed up all the advertising that used to go to magazines and radio shows and TV shows. And it went to Google instead, because Google and Facebook were collecting gigantic amounts of data on everybody. Your interest, your age, your income, where you were going, what sort of things you were doing. They used that and parlayed that to advertisers, to big corporations, and said, listen, we can give you, 50,000 people, all of whom are interested in your product, all of whom have Googled something similar, all of whom make a certain amount of money per month, et cetera, et cetera. These hyper-targeted ads were now a possibility thanks to technology from Google and Facebook. And they took away small ads as well, because, of course, the way newspapers and magazines often funded themselves was actually from these small ads, like trampoline $100. But that's all gone because, it's all on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever. And fast forward to now, Google's AI, which is now pretty much ubiquitous. If you Google anything, you'll see an AI thing right at the top. That is also destroying the livelihoods of websites across the world, because basically what it does is scrape the information from those websites and then displays it to you as their own information. And what that means is you don't click on those websites where you previously, a couple of years ago, would have, so that they don't get the advertising revenue. The advertising revenue is not shared with them. Google keeps all of that. And so there is an absolute apocalypse in terms of information sharing and information production online that is coming and is starting to hit. And it's thanks to Google that this is happening.
Well, I think we have to wrap up, but I could talk to you for a lot longer. Hopefully, we'll have you back if you would come. But this was wonderful. We really enjoyed talking to you, Alan, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, it's been fantastic to
And
talk to you. Hope to speak to you very soon.
thanks, Alan. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm still, for better or worse, on social media, specifically on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me at Alan R. McLeod on Twitter or alan.rmcleod on Instagram. Or you can just find me on mintpressnews.com, which is where I publish all my investigations.
Great. Well, thank you again for coming, and don't forget to like and subscribe this podcast. So, Alan, hope to have you back, and thanks for all you're doing to keep us our minds free. So we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.